Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And in this podcast, I want to look at the attempts by the Nazi Party to win over and ultimately to co-opt and control Germany's working classes. One of the great objectives of Nazism was to try to win the affections or the support of Germany's working class from what the Nazis viewed as a kind of Judeo-Bolshevist conspiracy. The way they thought about socialism was that it was something that was created by the Jews to bedevil and ensnare the working man. One of the basic aims of the Nazi Party, and this was expressed in the 25-point program, was this, and the idea that Hitler found abhorrent was that socialism was a kind of an internationalist idea. Obviously, in Marx's Communist Manifesto, endorses it incites the workers to unite. Workers of the world, unite! You have nothing to lose but your chains, or words to that effect. And the Nazi regime was all about creating a notion of national unity, national kind of the synchronization of all social classes together, and that one's own German blood should be the defining feature of an individual, not one's social class. And in the eyes of the Nazis, what socialism had done is it had created these false distinctions and told lies to the workers and set the workers against the bosses, whereas in reality there should be sort of synchronization and coordination, or Gleichschaltung is the term of society. Which would overcome class distinctions, and people would recognise that they had a role, be it the employer or the worker, and that role was to work for the greater good of Germany, the racial body. Before 1933, workers were by and large loyal to the Social Democratic Party. The more radical workers tended to support the communists rather than the Nazis, and Berlin was the centre of class struggle as far as the Nazis were concerned. Red Berlin, it was referred to by Joseph Goebbels. The National Socialist Factory Cell Organisation had attempted to create an alternative to the trade unions, trying to create political, Nazified political units within factories, but it had comparatively little success because it basically failed to answer the economic, social and political needs of the working class. It couldn't organise the kind of workplace solidarity that trade unions could, and that was principally protected wages and living standards or during the Great Depression. When the Nazis came to power, they were determined to destroy working class organisations that were hostile to their goals, and to win the support of workers for the new state. And the new regime, if it were to be successful in the goal of concentrating Germany's economic resources on rearmament, it would need to break the power of trade unions. Trade unions are real spanners in the works for this kind of thing, because what they're going to do is they're going to negotiate higher wages. Higher wages will eat into arms munitions budgets, and the upshot in the end was that workers did get paid quite well, with increasingly better wages towards the end of the 1930s when they were working in munitions factories. But that's sort of slightly later in the story. The destruction of organised labour was a key part in the process of rearmament. The policy of breaking the trade unions was also part of the tacit agreement that Hitler had with Germany's social and economic elites, the captains of industry, the Crooks and the Tysons and people like that. They were interested really in how troublemaking trade unionists could be eliminated, and Dachau and the emerging terror state is a key part of how that happened. Labour couldn't just be repressed, however, and couldn't just be ignored. And the workers had to have a convincing additional offer from the Nazis. There would be huge crisis if the labour unions were smashed and there wasn't something to replace them. 100 years ago, last week, the German working classes overthrew the Kaiser and the First World War abruptly ended. And the Nazis were well aware of this, and they were haunted by the memory of the end of the First World War. And they knew better than most that it had been ended with a revolution in Germany. Fortunately for Germany's ruling classes, a Bolshevik revolution in Germany had been postponed indefinitely, and in the brief times that it had been attempted, had been violently crushed. But that aside, it had been the working classes and the German army that had overthrown the Kaiser. The destruction of labour organisations was therefore, as far as the Nazis were concerned, also an insurance policy against a rerun of November 1918. So by January 1933, the following facts are relevant. Firstly, that German labour trade unions have developed in the last third of the 19th century, obviously since 1871, since Germany itself was created as a unified nation state. But the basis of labour relations, relations between trade unions, the workers, and the state, were created in the first year of the Weimar Republic, and those existed into the first year of the Third Reich. 3 organisations had created themselves. The free trade unions, which were close to the Social Democratic Party, and these were the biggest ones. Then there were the Catholic Christian trade unions, which were predominantly in Catholic industrial areas such as the Rhineland, and they were allied to the Centre Party. Finally, there were the small Heer-Stunker unions, which were linked to the Liberal Party. And the divisions within the trade union movement were ideal for the Nazis to exploit, and it weakened the union movement and enabled the Nazis to destroy it. Before 1914, employers and the state refused to recognise independent trade unions as the right and proper representatives of the working class. And so instead they encouraged company unions. These were tame trade unions established by companies, or they were referred to as yellow unions, that ensured that collective bargaining only went so far, and that protest and strike action could be easily contained. But the situation had changed in 1916. Because of the crisis of the war and the need for ever greater sacrifices from the working classes, and the need to win the cooperation of them, a trend had been established by which, under pressure from the military authorities, employers were obliged to give the trade unions much of what they asked for, and grant them also participation in the running of German industries. So this kind of corporatism, this encouragement, this sort of bringing of the working classes into the management was an act born of crisis. It's the kind of thing that capital does when it really can't think of any other alternative, and the alternative is something that they fear that the workers might come up with. At the end of 1918, the threat of revolution changed matters again. Because there was the fear that the regime might be overthrown. The trade unions became the de facto representatives of the workers. And so the traditional policy of delegitimizing trade unions was swept aside by the recognition that working class organisations needed to be engaged with, and engaged with thoroughly, because the working classes were immensely powerful in 1918 as a result of the pressures of the war. The right to strike and the employer's right to lock workers out of their workplaces were both recognised by law. And so that meant that both sides, both labour and capital, had powers to combat one another. Trade unions and the right to join trade unions were incorporated into the Weimar Constitution in 1919. And the same year, the German working class was guaranteed the ability to participate in the running of their factories, and by the establishment of works councils, which were I suppose legalized versions of the Soviets that had sprung up in Germany during the November Revolution. The representatives on the works councils were elected by the employees, and the system of labour courts, which were established to deal with industrial and trade disputes and strikes, were a kind of a safety valve within the system to ensure that management and workers could come and speak freely and negotiate without strike action occurring. So here was the system that the Nazis inherited, and this was the system that they were going to dismantle. To them, this was an abhorrent and an abhorrent kind of insult to Germany, and it was this workers' power which had destroyed the Kaiser's Germany and caused the defeat of an otherwise successful Germany. This is the delusion that they had. In March 1933, the Nazis left a number of free trade union officers devastated by the ransacking activities of the SA, who invaded the officers, beat up and arrested officials, and this was during the kind of the real Wild West period of SA power. As I've mentioned before, when looking at Nicholas Vashman's brilliant book KL, the SA were really improvising arrest and imprisonment, creating concentration camps, improvised concentration camps, sometimes in the cellars of beer kellers, and they were arresting people without any real mandate. They were arresting people simply because they could, and so there was a huge influx of trade unionists into the camp system and the prison system, and this was unrelated even to the anti-communist purge following the Reichstag fire. During March, many leading socialists and communists were purged from works councils and replaced by the SA. However, it's interesting to note that despite this, the works councils were able to continue, and in March 1933, there were nationwide elections to the works councils, of which Nazis only won 25% of the vote. And so this meant that if using electoral means failed, the regime would use any means necessary. On the 4th of April, the Nazis took control over works councils, and this was ensured by the law on plant representative councils and business organisations, which allowed authorities to prevent elections until the 30th of September that year, and in the meantime purged the councils of members who are opposed to the spirit of the state and the economy, which of course, and this is a great piece of Nazi legislation, so broad that it can mean virtually anything, and so ambiguous as to be applied to any circumstance that the Nazis chose. In April 1933, however, some trade unionists still hoped that the purge would be restricted to simply political organisations, and that they would be able to come to an arrangement with the new regime by depoliticising themselves. Remember that the trade unions tended to be affiliated to certain political parties, but they were able to break these affiliations and present themselves as simply apolitical membership organisations instead. This was inspired by a strand of thinking that had emerged during the war. The free trade unions had seen their cooperation with the military authorities as evidence that the two sides could collaborate, that the trade unions could be seen as cooperative and helpful, and that when, if push came to shove, if there was a more authoritarian regime, that some kind of understanding would be able to be forged. The executive committee of the umbrella organisation of the free trade unions offered cooperation in reorganising the trade unions and issued a statement in April 1933. And the statement read, "Loyal to its duty to cooperate in the construction of a social order for the German people, in which the basic rights of workers are secured in accordance with their national importance in the state and the German economy, the General German Trade Union Federation declares itself willing to place at the service of the new state the labour force's own organisation, which the trade unions have devoted years of activity to creating. The trade unions recognise now, as before, that their own freedom of action must be limited by the higher law of the state acting in its role as the representative of the whole national community. The state must have the right to intervene, to regulate and establish the order within the economy. Its duty is to create an economic constitution which binds the economic leadership to the fulfillment of overall economic obligations, because only in this way is it possible to achieve unity between the leadership of the state and the economy." So this was a huge capitulation to Nazism right away, but as you can probably imagine, this would go nowhere near the desires of the Nazis for full domination of Germany's working class. There would be no compromise, and it was an indication to the Nazis of the weakness of the position of Germany's trade unions. It was desired that there should be full Nazi control and organisation of labour, not a relationship between the Nazis and the trade unions on favourable terms. On the 21st of April 1933, plans were created to take over the trade unions, which had already been fundamentally weakened by the advent of Hitler in power, the arrival of Hitler in power in January 1933. The planning was to be carried out by Dr. Robert Ley, of whom I have spoken before, perhaps one of the most corrupt members of the Nazi regime. And he would create an organisation which would replicate the role of the trade unions, but do it in a way which actually constrained labour and kept wages at a moderate or low level in the interests of Hitler's wider agenda, particularly, of course, rearmament. The Nazis constantly liked to present themselves as sympathetic towards the workers, and they disguised their intentions. On the 1st of May, May Day, the International Workers' Day, this culminated in huge parades on May Day 1933, where employers and workers were seen as marching together as part of this new national coordination of the economy, what was modelled roughly on corporatism, fascist corporatism in Italy, and the idea that they were trying to present wasn't that the workers and bosses had conflicting and oppositional interests, but that they shared the same interests, which were the interests of Germany, the interests of the national commonwealth. On May Day, Hitler made a speech, ironically, to celebrate the great socialist festival, but they really kind of appropriate May Day for Nazism and racialize it. It was a day of not socialist celebration, but national celebration. The next day, the Nazi organizations, various occupied trade union offices throughout the Reich, confiscating their funds and arresting their leaders. And then Ley issued a proclamation which recognised that the workers, the support from the workers for the new regime was currently inadequate. He said, "German workers and employees, working people in town and country, the bells have rung in honour of work. The entire German nation has sung the praises of the working man with a strength and an enthusiasm without precedent, and thus has done honour to itself and the creative spirit. The wheels stopped, the sound of the anvil was not heard, the miner came out of his mine, everyone had a holiday. What trade unions of all shades, red and black, Christian and free, have not even come near to achieving, what even at the height of Marxism was only a shadow, a feeble, miserable imitation compared to the gigantic thing of yesterday, National Socialism has achieved with its first attempt. It puts worker and peasant, artisan and the employee, in short, all working people, at the centre of its thought and action, and therewith at the centre of the state, and renders the grabbers and the functionaries harmless. Well, who was that servant of capitalism, that reactionary who was out to oppress you and rob you of your rights? Was it those red criminals who for years have abused you? Well-meaning, honest and decent German workers, in order to deprive you, and with you the whole German people, of your rights? Or we, who amidst the unspeakable suffering and sacrifices fought against these insane and crazy ideas of devilish Jews and their cronies? 3 months after National Socialist government have already proved to you Adolf Hitler is your friend. Adolf Hitler struggles for your liberty. Adolf Hitler gives you bread." So after the seizure of trade union offices and after the arrest of trade unionists, what the Nazis sought to do then was to co-opt the language and the ideas of Marxism, to co-opt the ideas of class struggle, and to present the Nazis as being the saviours of the working class, but the saviours, those that were able to save the working class on the basis of constructing a national as opposed to a social ideology. Anyway, I will be looking at the development of German labour organisations, Nazi labour organisations, in the not too distant future. But I hope you found this useful. Sorry for the short break, been away in Germany of all places, and I will be back with you this time next week. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this and find it useful. All the best, and do swing by our Facebook page. All the best, and bye bye.